What we've talked about up to this point has been really an oversimplification of genetics. What we've dealt with so far, we have dealt with this kind of simplification idea that there's a gene that controls a trait, and it's either a dominant or it's recessive. That's true with some things. Gregor Mendel studied pea plants. Very fortunately, the pea plants he studied when he came up with these conclusions were like that. There were 7 different traits that were either dominant or recessive, and they were controlled by one gene and only. That's not true with everything, okay? So when Mendel was going through and he looked at these pea plants, the idea of independent assortment came up, and what we talked about in meiosis is when we had our homologous pairs of chromosomes that came from our mom and our dad, right? We use red and blue or green and red a lot of times. That if this one was red and this one is green, it's random of how these 2 chromosomes lined up during metaphase 1. Did it go red-green or did it go green-red? And that arrangement is random and independent of how the next pair lined up, and the next pair. All 23 pairs were random and independent of each other. It's like flipping a coin, right? Me flipping my quarter is random and independent of how my nickel flips. But he wanted to see if one allele impacted the other. So the fact that a pea was yellow versus round, did the yellow coloration have any impact on whether the peas were wrinkled or round? And he came up with the conclusion that no, they don't. And what he did is he did these dihybrid crosses, and we get these really big Punnett squares, kind of like mine here. But when he took big R, big R, big Y, he went through and he got all of a F1 generation, and then he took all of those big R, big Y's, little y's, heterozygous, dihybrid, and he crossed it. He found that if he had a round yellow heterozygous, and he crossed it with a round yellow heterozygous, he got these, statistically, his results came out. I believe it's a 9 to 3 to 3 to 1, 9. It's 9 of these to 3 of these. Yeah, 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. So he had 9 dominant. He had 3 dominant recessive. He had 3 recessive dominant, and he had 1 recessive. Statistically, that's how it worked out. Just if we were to go through and count up heads, tails, kind of thing. But he came up with the conclusion that one gene did not impact the other. Okay? So these are determined by, traits are passed on from generation to generation. Some traits are dominant over others. Each sexually reproducing organism had 2 copies of each gene. We get one from our mom, one from our dad. And that these alleles usually segregate separately. However, there's more to it. That's an oversimplification that we've been talking about so far. There are some things that have more than 2 alleles. You know, besides yellow and green, there might be yellow, green, and blue. There might be yellow, green, blue, purple, 18 colors, I don't know. There can be more than just the dominant or recessive allele. There might be multiples. Sometimes these traits are controlled in simply more than one gene. And sometimes they're not just a dominant or recessive. Sometimes they're incomplete dominance, or they're codominance, or they're multiple alleles, or they're polygenic traits. So incomplete dominance. If something is incompletely dominant, I always think about the heterozygous being in between. Incomplete, in between. So there's certain species of flowers that when you take a red flower and a white flower, and you pollinate them, and we're saying homozygous red, homozygous white, and when we cross them, we get pink. Now, earlier, prior to Mendel, this would support the blending hypothesis. The blending hypothesis was this idea that if we took 2 traits and we let them cross, we're going to get a mixture, something in between, which pink is in between red and white, I would consider, right? That we get this blending. Okay, so you can say, so the blending hypothesis is correct. Well, no, it's not. Because what we can do then is we can take this RW, this pink flower, RW, and we can take another RW pink flower, and that when we go through and we cross the heterozygous, what happens is we get pink, right? So pink and pink make pink, yep. But what also came back out is we got red came back out and the white came back out. So the blending hypothesis was like that idea that if I took blue food coloring and yellow food coloring and I mix it, I get green. But if I took green and green, I'm gonna get green and I'm forever gonna get green. Mendel saw that sometimes these traits come back out. So like every now and then we might get some yellows. But also with incompletes, we sometimes get blue and yellow back out. So incomplete dominance is in between. There's certain flowers that do this. So incomplete dominance means the red is not dominant over the white, that neither of them are really dominant. And when we get that heterozygous cross, we get something in between. There's another type of trait that's called codominance. And a codominant trait is when we have two traits that are both dominant. Okay, so if we were to use like people's voices, if my voice is really loud, which it generally is, if my voice is really loud and someone's kind of talking quietly in the corner, who are you going to hear? Me, because I'm dominating it, right? If we're both kind of talking at the same volume, we're going to kind of get both of us, right? And that's the idea of codominance. If we're both yelling, it's kind of chaotic, but we kind of hear both. So if we have two things that both are dominant traits, both of the traits are expressed or are seen. So an example is a species of chicken that if black is dominant and white is dominant, if we take a homozygous black, big B, and we cross it with a big W, what we get is we get 4 out of 4 are big B's, big W's. It's not black, it's not white, it's not gray, because gray would be in between, but it's black and white, or what they often refer to as a checkered pattern. We see both the black and the white. That's a codominant trait. Blood type is also a very common example that we use for codominance. And we have 3 different blood type alleles. We have O, A, and B. And there's 4 different blood types we can have. We can have A blood type, we can have B blood type, we can have O blood type, but we can also get A and B. We call it AB. So A is a dominant blood type, B is a dominant allele, I should say. And when you combine an A and a B, we get AB, where O is recessive. So if we have an A and an O, we only see the A. If we get a B and an O, we see only the B. If we get O and O, then we see the recessive O trait. But codominant is when we see both are being expressed. So for blood type, we see both A and B. For the chicken, we see the white and the black. Again, there's often more than just a green and a yellow. We also have these things called multiple alleles. Allele is just a possible coloration or variation. And sometimes there's more than 2. Blood type, I just gave you, there's 3. A, O, and B. There's 3 alleles. So multiple alleles is just there's more possibilities in nature, and then how those combine give us the different variations that we see. So we have multiple alleles. There's also this thing called polygenic traits. And polygenic traits is really the opposite of the simplification that we've talked about. So we've talked about one gene, one trait. We've talked about either this or this. Well, this is putting a lot of those things that we said it's this or this, and we're kind of going against it. So polygenic traits, poly meaning many, genics meaning genetic, and traits meaning like how things physically look, is there are some traits that are controlled by more than one or many genes. Skin color or skin coloration is an example of that. So when we look around the room, we see lots of variation of our skin color. And it's not controlled by a single gene. And for humans, it's actually controlled by 4 different genes. And the combination of those 4 different genes and how those genes are expressed give us the variations that we see. So we have a pretty big spectrum of coloration within our pigmentation, which means we have different amount of melanin in our skin or pigmentation. Polygenic is this idea that we have more than one gene controls it. Now we've also said that me flipping a quarter has absolutely no impact on me flipping my nickel, which is true when we're flipping quarters and nickels. But it's not always true with traits. If you look at someone who has very fair skin, or someone with very dark skin, there's often, not always, but there's often hair colorations that go along with that. So if you have fairly light skin complexion, you probably have blonde or red hair. Not necessarily, but chances are probably the lighter your skin is, the lighter your hair is. Again, not always. The darker your pigmentation is, generally the darker your hair is. There's some correlations between skin coloration and hair color. They are not always separate from one another, like we said with flipping a quarter, or yellow pea plants, yellow peas versus orange versus fruit. And this is a big one. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm one slide ahead. So the idea that Mendel came up with is he very specifically looked at plants, pea plants. So the conclusions he drew were based upon his plants and his pea plants, and really only that. So it was probably a safe assumption to say, well, he probably thought that it also applied to animals, but that isn't what his studies were. So there was another scientist that, his name was Thomas Hunt Morgan, and he chose to use fruit flies. They're small, they're easy to keep, and you can produce lots of offspring in a very short period of time. So you can do generation after generation after generation and generations of fruit flies within a relatively short period of time. Depending upon what animal you choose, to see some of the traits that we're looking at might take years and years and years just to see that trait that we're hoping for. And generally, ethically, people aren't too concerned about fruit flies. I had 200 fruit flies. I killed 200 fruit flies because my study was over. Most people aren't going to get all worked up about fruit flies, right? But if you were to do that to say, well, let's go to the extreme, no, let's not go there. Okay, where other animals we sometimes tend to care more about. So Thomas Hunt Morgan chose fruit flies, and other scientists often use fruit flies because of this, and they actually have some pretty interesting genetics. They have like spots on their wings that get inherited from one generation to the next. But then Morgan actually concluded that it also includes all animals, including us. Okay, so some of these findings that Mendel said also apply to animals, which we are the animal. Genetics and the environment are pretty. Genetics, when we talk about genetics, it's inherited traits, right? So a lot of times we are under this assumption that you look the way you look because of your genes. You act the way you act because of your genes. That's part of the story, but it's part of the story. If we go through and we look at different things, the environment has an impact on things. You behave the way you do, partially because of genetics, but also because of the experiences you've had throughout your life, right? There was a video we showed a couple years ago because we had time. It was called, what was it called? 3 Perfect Strangers? I think it was 3 Perfect Strangers. That sounds right. And it was a story of 3 identical twins that were separated at birth. They didn't know each other existed until like college. 2 of them like happened to, well, how did the story go? One of the twins went to college, and people were like, hey, I didn't think you were coming back this year. And he's like, what are they talking about? In the end, it was this twin. And then they were on like TV, like, hey, twins united. Look at this. 2 twins found each other on like some college campus. And then the one guy was like watching TV, he's like, they look just like me. So they were triplets actually. So then there was some, it ended up, this was a very intentional separation. It was a case study of like how different upbringings would affect human behavior. They put one of the triplets in like a middle class. They put one in a low income and a high income And then they kept visiting him throughout their years, completely unknowing to the parents who adopted these children. But did that have some impact? It's this kind of the idea called nature versus nurture. Does the nature or nurture, how you're brought up, have a bigger impact? Okay, so there was huge ethical issues with that one. But the idea is, if we kind of take a step back and say, well, what about a sunflower? If I have the perfect I'm growing sunflowers for some competition, and the competition is to grow the tallest sunflower possible, and I have the winning seed right here. I know it because I just know it. Just because I have the winning seed genetically, does that mean my sunflower is going to win the competition? I got to do some things right. If I plant that seed, I water it, and then I go on vacation, and it doesn't rain for like a month, is that seed going to grow to its full potential? No, it probably died while I was on vacation. I'm going to lose the competition. If I don't plant it in the proper sun, it's not going to grow to its full potential. Okay? So the idea is genes are the plan, but the environment is how the plan unfolds. Is it possible for your hair color to not be natural? Is it possible for your hair color to be different than what your genes say it to be? Yes, obviously you know that. Same idea. If I were to lose a hand in an accident, did that impact how I look? Yeah, right, I'm missing a hand. What was that because of the genes that I had? No, right? It's not genetic that I'm missing a hand, it's because I had an accident. So the environment definitely has an impact on how things look, how they behave. You take a dog, and how you treat that dog during the early puppy stages is going to change how that dog is later on. Right? If you had a puppy when you were a kid, you can clone that puppy. Technology is here that you can pay enough money and you can get an exact genetic copy of that puppy. But that puppy that you had when you were 1, 2, and 3, when it was a puppy and you were 1, if you get that exact genetic copy of that puppy at age 16, are you going to play with the puppy the same way you did when you were 1? Is the dog going to run away from you the same way maybe you did then when you were 1? Are you going to treat that dog differently? And the answer is yeah. So is that puppy that you love so dearly at age 12 going to behave the same way 12 years later when you take that genetic clone? Maybe not. Okay? So does the environment have an impact? Absolutely, it does.